We're looking at the Americas in the modern era. I'm going to start by looking at a series of revolutions that's going to sweep through Latin America at the beginning of this modern period. And these revolutions were caused by a lot of the same factors that caused the revolutions in the United States and the revolutions in Europe that we looked at earlier. And these same Enlightenment ideas that inspired the American Revolution and the French Revolution are also going to inspire these Latin American revolutions. And then the American Revolution, and to an extent the French Revolution, also provided inspiration for these Latin American revolutions as well. And then also, because all of Latin America was under, for the most part, Spanish and Portuguese control, as the French Revolution broke out and as Napoleon was conquering the Iberian Peninsula, well, this provided this window of opportunity for these Latin American nations to break away. While Spain and Portugal were busy dealing with Napoleon, Latin America had an opportunity to gain their independence. And so all of these independence movements take place at about the same time frame. So we're going to start with the Haitian Revolution. And the Haitian Revolution is one of the revolutions that's quite a bit different from all of the other revolutions that we'll look at. And first off, the territory that would become Haiti was known as Saint-Domingue. This was a French colony on the island of Hispaniola. It made up the western third of the island. And it was extremely profitable. It was under French control and produced about a third of France's major trade goods. And so it was extremely profitable for France, and it was dominated by a small number of white planters. And because most of the territory was made up of sugar plantations, most of the population were slaves. About 90% of the population were slaves. So the slaves outnumbered the whites about 10-1 or so. The working conditions were terrible, and the Enlightenment ideals that had inspired these other revolutions began to seep into Haiti. Furthermore, there were a small number of free blacks who had actually gone and helped fight in the American Revolution. And so when they came back, they brought those ideas of revolution and Enlightenment ideas and ideas of freedom back to Haiti with them as well. So the Haitian Revolution starts as a slave revolt. And really, it's the only successful slave revolt in all of world history when you look at the fact that the slaves actually revolted and in the end gained their independence and gained their freedom. And so it starts as a slave uprisings, and gradually these slave uprisings begin to spread throughout the territory, and they kind of were in this window of opportunity. While Napoleon was busy taking over territory in Europe, they kind of saw this as their opportunity to gain their freedom. And so gradually these slave revolts begin to spread, and eventually they come to conquer most of the island. And the leader of the Haitian Revolution is going to be a man named Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint Louverture basically took this slave revolt and turned it into a well-disciplined army and turned this slave revolt into a true revolution. And he's going to help organize the Haitian forces and use it to defeat French troops. And they're going to have success in taking over the island. Napoleon actually sends over a small group of reinforcements led by General Leclerc to try to restore order to Haiti. But the French troops, not only are they defeated by the Haitian troops, but they were taken out by tropical diseases, especially yellow fever. Yellow fever completely ravaged the French troops. And so between the leadership of Toussaint Louverture and the army and the diseases, ultimately Haiti will win their independence. And they're going to drive the French out and declare their independence in 1803. and they're going to establish a republic, much like the United States. When we look at the rest of Latin America, again, the same Enlightenment ideas are going to inspire these Latin American revolutions. Also, the American Revolution especially, but also the French Revolution, is going to inspire these independence movements. And then also, again, the window of opportunity provided by Napoleon and the French Revolution is going to play a big role as well. In fact, when we look at Latin America, a lot of it was under Spanish control. Well, when Napoleon pushes into Spain, not only does that lead to conflict, but Spain also was struggling with finding a true king. And so they were dealing with issues of secession as well. And so it provided this perfect window of opportunity for these Latin American territories to break free. When we look at all of the Latin American independence movements, pretty much all of them were led by the Creole class. And so if you remember, Latin American society was divided into classes based on race. And so at the top were your peninsularies. These were Europeans who came over here and had all the political power. Underneath that were your Creoles or your Criollos, who were people of European descent that had been born in the Americas. Then in the middle, you had your mixed race peoples like your mestizos. And then at the bottom were your slaves and natives. And so all of these independence movements are going to be led by that Creole class. And the Creoles wanted to take political power from the peninsularies without having to extend freedom all the way down to the middle and lower classes. So Mexico's independence. Mexico's independence initially is going to be led by Father Miguel Hidalgo. And Father Miguel Hidalgo tries to lead an independence movement with support from the middle classes, from the mestizos. And ultimately, because he included the mestizos in this push for independence, the Creoles are going to stop supporting him. And the Creoles are going to kind of help put down Father Miguel Hidalgo's push for independence. And instead, they're going to go on and lead their own push for independence. They didn't want an independence movement led by the middle classes, because then they would have to extend freedom down to the middle classes. And so then the Creoles are going to lead their own push for independence, which would eventually be successful. And Mexico is going to, for a brief period of time, about a year, create a dictatorship, but they quickly transition to a republic as well. That's another common characteristic we're going to see throughout Latin America, is the creation of republics. Pretty much all, with one key exception, are going to create republics. In the rest of Latin America, we have two key leaders that are going to lead independence movements in South America. Simón Bolívar was a Creole who led independence movements in the northern parts of South America. He was greatly inspired by the American Revolution, and especially George Washington. In fact, he saw himself as kind of the George Washington of South America. And he's going to help lead independence movements in Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Peru. And ultimately, he had hopes of creating what he called a Gran Colombia. This would have been a single nation that united most of Latin America, and very similar to the United States. And so he actually eventually combines his efforts with José de San Martín in the south. José de San Martín helped lead independence movements in Bolivia and Argentina and Chile, and then kind of unites with Bolivar. But ultimately, the hopes for a Gran Colombia are going to fail. And the main reason for the failure was there were simply too many geographic barriers that separated South America and economic differences. And so ultimately, this hopes for a Gran Colombia would not come to fruition. The exception when it comes to the creation of republics is going to be Brazil. Brazil's independence is a little bit different. Brazil was under Portuguese control, and gradually Brazil had become really kind of the key possession of Portugal. And so when Napoleon pushes into the Iberian Peninsula, the king and queen of Brazil or Portugal are going to be forced to flee. And so they flee to Brazil. And that becomes kind of the center of Portugal while Napoleon's pushing through the Iberian Peninsula. Well, once Napoleon's defeated and order is restored, and we have the restoration of the monarchies back in Europe, the king and queen return back to Portugal. But they leave their son Pedro in charge of Brazil. And then Pedro is going to declare Brazil's independence from Portugal. And after a short conflict, it only lasted about a year, fighting off Portuguese troops, Brazil would gain their independence. And unlike the other parts of Latin America, Brazil is going to create a monarchy. And so Pedro will become the first king of a now independent Brazil. So when we look at these independence movements, pretty much all of them were led by the Creole class. Even in Brazil's case, Pedro was under pressure from the Creoles of Brazil to push for independence. And so almost all of them were led by the Creole class. And because of that, the Creoles were the main ones to gain anything from these independence movements. They took over political power from the Peninsulares. For the most part, the extension of freedoms did not go lower than the middle classes. The mestizos acquired a few benefits, but not many. And the lower classes, there were really no key changes. And so when we look at the Caribbean region together, most of Latin America would gain their independence under this period. A lot of the Caribbean, however, is going to remain under European control.